Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot, Vicky. This is a really exciting event for me tonight. It's my real pleasure to introduce our speakers. In case you're wondering, Jim is still with us. He's in the call somewhere. Hi, Jim. And we know he's here. But tonight we get to introduce the speakers. I'm going to introduce Seth Powell first, and then Melanie Klein. So Seth is a scholar of Indian religions, Sanskrit and yoga traditions. He's currently a PhD candidate in South Asian religions at Harvard University, and he specializes in the history, theory, and practice of pre-modern Sanskrit yoga texts and traditions, as well as their intersections with the culture and practice of modern transnational yoga. He's currently dissertating. It's a lovely, that's from your bio. That's a great verb. I might steal that one. Dissertating on a 15th century South Indian yoga text called the Shiva Yoga Pradipika, or the Lamp on Shiva Yoga. He's also conducted extensive fieldwork throughout the Hindu temples of the Deccan, documenting yoga's history through its visual and material culture. His work is at the intersections of the disciplines of Indology, religious studies, and art history, but he's also the founder and director of Yogic Studies, which is an online educational platform dedicated to bringing scholarly and practitioner yoga communities together and offering cutting-edge courses in yoga's histories, philosophies, and Sanskrit language. And I'm sure everyone on the call has heard of Yogic Studies. We also have Melanie Klein joining us. So Melanie's a successful, highly acclaimed writer, professor of sociology and women's studies. Her areas of interest and speciality include media literacy education, body image, and the intersectional analysis of systems of power and privilege. Her work has been featured in many yoga practitioner outlets such as Yoga Journal, Yoga International, Mind Body Green, Mantra Yoga, and Health Magazine, Gayam, but also she's done work with the National Eating Orders Association in America. Most importantly for us, she's co-founder of the Yoga and Body Image Coalition, which has been at the forefront of online advocacy work to widen public perceptions of yoga practitioners in many ways. She's a natural collaborator, just as Seth is. She's co-editor and contributor to numerous books aimed at both scholars and practitioners, including Yoga, the Body and Embodied Social Change with Beth Varilla and Chelsea Jackson Roberts. And she was also a contributor to 21st Century Yoga, Culture, Politics and Practice by Horton and Harvey. Now, we are, as Vicky said, doing things slightly different tonight. What we believe is the best research and the best exposure you can have to research is research as a conversation, not just between scholars and practitioner communities, but between scholars themselves. Yoga, history, philosophy, and practice, as you all know, is vast in scope. The field is quite small, and none of us can cover all of the disciplines involved, from philology to anthropology to anatomy to everything else besides. And we rely on each other a lot, not just in sharing our research, but in an exchange of ideas which shapes research in progress. So what we're bringing you tonight really is a flavor of academic debate at its best, bringing together what pre-modern historians might be able to figure out about issues that we know are of vital interest to contemporary practitioners. It's a topic of immense interest, but with little published research, and we're inviting you to be part of that conversation, basically, as it happens. Seth's going to begin with some of the historical evidence and some perspectives on it. Melanie Klein will respond. I have some notes from Jacqueline Hargreaves, who couldn't be here tonight, and then we're going to open it up, and I'm sure there are people, I know there are people in the audience who want to join in. So without further ado, here's Seth Powell.
All right, can you hear me okay? Thumbs up, great. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Thumbs up if you can see that. All right, great. Well, greetings everyone from Northern California. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you on what is a very rainy morning. Let me begin by expressing my thanks to SOAS, to the Center of Yoga Studies. What an incredible lecture series you guys have been putting on, and thanks to the pandemic, we've all been getting to enjoy it. So I'm really happy and honored to be here and to contribute in some small way to this program. Thanks to Theo Wildcroft for her kind invitation to bring me on, to Melanie Klein for being a co-panelist here and respondent. And big thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to be here. I look forward to the Q&A and to hopefully a rich conversation on the other side. So what I'm going to do here for the next 25 minutes or less, Theo, keep an eye on the time, is to explore the themes of yoga, accessibility, and disability through looking at the historical sources. Now, as usual, a few disclaimers here before I begin. Some of this I think goes without saying, but is really worth emphasizing here in the beginning to preface this conversation today. So, whoops, why is my, let's see, okay, good. When we're looking at yoga's past, the history of yoga, we really want to be careful not to project our modern concerns, values, ideologies, visions of what we think and want yoga to be onto the past. That is, we should attempt, why is this not working when I click my advanced arrow, it doesn't, it's giving me that beep. Do you hear that? That's so frustrating. Okay, I think if I click, it'll work. We should really attempt to employ the scholarly epoché, that is the suspension of judgment, and to the extent that this is even possible, right? Of course, we're all shaped by our own samskaras, our own culture, time and place, and trainings, right? But we're going to at least make the attempt to understand, these materials on their own. Now, there's things I'm going to share today that I know will not sit well with most yoga practitioners. So I invite you to try to view them from within their own historical time and place. There's cultural differences here that need to be acknowledged in epistemology, that is ways of constructing knowledge, in shaping personal as well as social identities, the ontology or nature of the body, and all of its various layers and levels, as well as notions of health and wellness, things that we just want to be sensitive to here. So we really want to try to understand the past and these historical materials that we're going to look at through its own context and really on their own terms. Finally, let me just acknowledge here, I'm not an expert by any means on disability or on disability studies. My expertise really lies in pre-modern yoga. And for much of this conversation, at least this first part here, the materials we're going to look at are going to be mainly from pre-modern Hatha and Raja yoga traditions, although at the end we'll slightly move beyond this horizon. So the following questions are going to animate this first part and our historical survey. Who were the practitioners of Hatha yoga in pre-modern India? Who were the authors of Sanskrit and vernacular texts on yoga? What religious communities and identities did they come from? How accessible was this yoga? That is to say, who had access to these teachings on yoga and even to these texts? Are there indications within the texts that issues of inclusivity and exclusivity mattered? Are there moments, moreover, in yoga and India's history more broadly, where people with physical disabilities were also practitioners of yoga? And here in particular, we'll look at a couple of stories that might shine some light on this question. And we'll ask, what can we learn about yoga from these texts and from these stories? Okay, so needless to say here, this brief survey in the time slotted today is not going to be exhaustive by any means whatsoever. There's going to be many things that are missed and left out, maybe things we can pick up in the Q&A, but I'm going to aim to survey and draw out some major themes that we can summarize from across the vast archive of historical texts and materials. So to begin, when we look at who were the practitioners of Hatha yoga, and we think about a social identity and demographic of the Hatha yogi, I don't think it's controversial to say at this point for anybody who's been paying attention to this scholarship that we know that the majority of yoga practitioners were male, they were celibate, they were renunciates and ascetics who had renounced or transcended the world, engaged in yoga practices full-time as a religious discipline, in search of either worldly or spiritual powers, or indeed spiritual liberation and even the transcendence of this world. This emphasis on celibacy in particular is a very common theme throughout this literature. And in fact, yogis are commonly told in the text to even avoid women so as not to detract from their spiritual progress. Hopefully this is not cut off for you. Some of the videos are cutting off this text. Can you see it okay? So in a text like the 15th century Hatha Pradipika, we see things like one should avoid engaging with, I think it says, fire, women, and travel, at least in the beginning of one's practice. There's a very strong emphasis here, in particular along the lines of celibacy, on what's known as the cultivation of bindu dharana, or the retention of semen within the body. Semen understood as this vital life force, the force of procreation, the force that understood from within the metaphysics and physiology of pre-modern yoga, when lost, in particular through ejaculation, is weakening and lessening the lifespan and vital life force of the yogi. So we see lots of textual descriptions like this. This is from the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, 12th or 13th century. The yogi looks like the god of love. Then a great obstacle can arise for the yogin if he is not careful. Overcome by his beauty, women want to have sex with him. If he has sex, his semen is lost. Through loss of semen, bindu, his lifespan is diminished and becomes weak. Therefore, he should carefully carry out his practice, avoiding the company of women. Through constant retention of semen, a fine odor arises in the body of the yogin, so the yogin should make every effort to preserve his semen. Now, this emphasis on celibacy, on asceticism and renunciation, and the demographic of male practitioners, this is evidenced throughout the texts that are often written from the male gaze, describing male physical anatomies and bodily parts, but also when we look beyond the texts to art historical materials, physical culture in the form of sculptures, paintings and illustrated manuscripts. Again, by and large, the predominant yogic body and gender and depiction of the yogi is of a male ascetic. Now, of course, there are some really important exceptions to the general rule here of the male ascetic. In particular, we have some really beautiful and fine Mughal miniature paintings of female ascetics. And Ruth Westerby, who's here with us, is doing fantastic work exploring this very question. But I think the degree to which these paintings of female ascetics, the degree to which these tapasvinis, female cultivators of tapas, the degree to which they would have self-identified as yoginis, or that they were practitioners of the methods of Haṭhayoga, is really uncertain. And we really just have very little historical information about who female practitioners would have been. We can say more about that shortly. Now, against the general trend of ascetic yoga, in the Sanskrit Hatha Yoga literature, we do find teachings that are definitely directed towards householders. That is to say, those who are not renunciates or ascetics, who are living in the world, who are non-celibate and even married. So some teachings at the end of the Shiva Samhita, for example, verses like this: living in a house filled with children and a wife and so forth, internally abandoning attachment, seeing the mark of success on the path of yoga, the householder has fun having mastered my teaching. So says Shiva. Okay, so we do have exceptions where there really are teachings clearly directed at householders living and engaged in the world. But again, these are exceptions to the general theme and rule of asceticism. We also certainly have some textual references to female practitioners, but again, they're quite rare and often from the perspective, and again, from kind of the male gaze of the author of a Sanskrit text, or even in service of the male practitioner. So a very interesting section here from the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. This is actually within the context of the teachings on Vajrali Mudra, the urethral suction. A man should strive to find a woman devoted to the practice of yoga. Either a man or a woman can obtain success if they have no regard for one another's gender and practice with only their own ends in mind. If the semen moves, then the yogin should draw it upwards and preserve it. Semen preserved in this way truly overcomes death. Death arises through the fall of semen, life from its preservation. All yogins achieve success through the preservation of semen. And in the Hatha Pradipika, as many of you will know, there are some similar verses and descriptions of Vajrali Mudra for female practitioners. So this is quite interesting, and I think is definitely suggestive that there are female practitioners, right? A man should strive to find a woman devoted to the practice of yoga. That would seem to suggest that there are such practitioners out there. But again, it's definitely written from the male gaze and in service here of the male practitioner. Now, one thing just to keep in mind, we can talk more about this later in the discussion, I think, is we should take some of these verses with a grain of salt. They are prescriptive texts. They are not necessarily documenting what is happening on the ground, but they're idealized versions of yoga theory and practice. But I think behind the writing of verses like this, we do get glimpses into the sort of quotidian and social dimensions of the authors and practitioners. Now, who were the authors of these texts and what religious communities did they come from? How might they have identified themselves? Previous generations of scholarship, if you read anything about Haṭhayoga, you know it would have been ascribed to the Nath Yogis of Matsyendra and Gorakhnath and so forth. We now know, thanks to the incredible tidal wave of research that's come out in the last few decades, especially folks like Jim Mallinson and Jason Birch and the Haṭhayoga Project, we know that Haṭhayoga during the medieval period, that is really during the 12th through 18th century into the early modern period even, it really became pan-Indic. Haṭhayoga cannot be tied down to one particular religious or sectarian tradition. Although the Nathas are certainly one of the key groups who were responsible for the development and practice of Haṭhayoga, there's many different traditions that were integrating the techniques and even codifying Sanskrit treatises from within various religious and philosophical milieus. Texts show influences from Vajrayana Buddhism, all different stripes of Shaivism, Vaishnavism, especially as we get into the early modern period, Advaita Vedanta with the writing of the new corpus of Yoga Upanishads. We have Jain texts that are integrating asana and Haṭhayoga, as well as you can see in this beautiful image of the Bar al-Hayat, the Islamic Sufi engagement with Haṭhayoga during the Mughal period. Okay, so in terms of thinking of who did yoga, who wrote about yoga, who had access to yoga, it really can't be limited to any one particular religious tradition. It really is sort of trans-sectarian in this way. And that's really important to acknowledge. And I think is expressed in the attitudes of some of the authors of these early texts, again, like the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. Certainly you've all seen this quote that's sort of become famous in these sort of circles. Again, translation by James Mallinson. if diligent, everyone, even the young or the old or the diseased, gradually obtains success in yoga through practice. Whether a Brahmin, an ascetic, Buddhist, Jain, a skull bearer, Kapalika, or the Charvaka materialist, the atheist, the wise man endowed with faith who is constantly devoted to his practice obtains complete success, Sarva-siddhi. Success happens for he who performs the practices. How could it happen for one who does not? I think that there's a lot going on actually in a verse like this that we don't have full time right now to unpack. There's this really consistent theme here we see across these texts in the emphasis on practice, this notion that anyone can do the practice, although we'll question that here a little bit. But what's important above and beyond even philosophy or sectarian affiliation is the practice itself. And if you don't do the practice, how do you expect to attain any results? It does seem when we read quotes like this from these early texts that the authors were concerned with a certain type of accessibility, at least in the rhetoric in which they're writing. They're trying to free these methods of yoga from any one single sectarian or religious ownership. They're at least advertising the practice, and we can question the degree to which on the ground that this actually occurred, but they're at least advertising it in the text as something that is available to all. And indeed, we do see in the sheer range and diversity of the religious backgrounds of the authors of these texts that it was the methods of Hatha Yoga were adopted by a wide variety of communities. Now, other ways in which the practices themselves are perhaps framed in ways that we might think of as more accessible or as specific even to particular demographics or capacities are verses like this from the Shiva Yoga Pradipika, where after listing 10 asanas, this is in the Ashtanga Yoga section, it teaches 10 asanas, probably all seated postures. Then it follows and says, these 3 postures are the best. Lotus is for householders. Siddhasana is for those on paths other than householders, that is to say, ascetics. And Sukhasana, a comfortable or pleasant posture, easy posture, if you will, is for all. So Lotus for householders, Siddhasana for ascetics, and Sukhasana for all. These are the best. Indeed, any asana may be praised and mastered. Seated in one of these asanas, according to one's desire, the yogin should abide in a solitary place. The idea here really is that, as with a lot of these earlier Hatha Yoga texts, just pick one asana, master it, sit down in it, and then move on to pranayama. The rest will start to take care of itself. But it is interesting directing certain types of postures for ascetics and non-ascetics. And I can come back to this in the Q&A if those are interested. I think there's a reason why these particular postures are specified. But then note that the yogi should then go abide in a solitary place. And the next part of the text gives these beautiful descriptions of the yoga hut. In this text, it's actually more like a yoga Airbnb. It's like really luxurious with a beautiful garden and lots of pillows and cushions. But nonetheless, it's in a solitary place removed from society. Now, another really important element here to point out in terms of who has access to these teachings, well, it's really somebody who has access to a competent and qualified guru. And just about every single text makes this point and makes it really clear on the importance of the guru. So I'll just read a couple passages here quickly from Shiva Yoga Pradipika, but you could really pick any text to find things like this. long life, freedom from disease, abundant powers, knowledge, fame, the joy of heaven, and liberation. Right? All these different goals for a practice. How is a person deprived of a guru capable to obtain all these fruits? One should worship a guru who is endowed with the characteristics spoken, who's honorable, knowledgeable in all aims of life, with actions, mind, and speech, just as one would worship Shiva. Therefore, because of the guru alone, for one who is initiated, dikshita, who seeks refuge in Shiva, the happiness obtained through the fruits of the fourfold aims of life, the purusharthas, rests in his hand. This is actually a very interesting verse. It's less common in the Haṭhayoga literature to see language of initiation or diksha spoken about, but I think it's something that is typically implied in a guru shishya milieu. But here the Shiva Yoga Pradipika does spell that out. So again, in terms of access and receiving teachings and engaging in practice, one must go through a guru and perhaps even receive initiation. Other verses that one can only approach Raja Yoga, this royal yoga, by means of a true guru and not by any other actions. Now, of course, the question arises, what is a true guru? How does one discern a true guru from a false guru? Well, the text spells out what a true guru is: one who knows through their very own nature, the Atman, which has no equal, is without end, unparalleled, stainless, emotionless, eternal flame, the supreme immortal nectar of bliss comprised of consciousness. One who knows that truly is a true guru. Another way in which the practices and even systems of yoga are categorized, as well as sometimes almost ranked in these texts, is through the system of 4 yogas: mantra, laya, hatha, and raja yoga. And typically they are given in a hierarchy, where mantra yoga is seen as the lowest or even easiest approach, and raja yoga being kind of the pinnacle of all yogas, and sometimes the most advanced. Texts like the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra and others point this out, in some ways almost poking fun at the mantra yogin. That which can be mastered by all and sundry is called mantra yoga. Lowly is the yogin entitled to practice it. The lowest aspirant, he is of little wisdom, resorts to this yoga. For this yoga of mantras is said to be the lowest of yogas. Other texts frame this, differently. Sometimes it's not such a pejorative rendering, but there's this notion that anybody can just chant mantras and focus the mind through chanting, mantras. But these other yogas require more discipline, a more advanced disposition, and so on and so forth. But throughout most of these presentations, it's Raja Yoga that is always seen as the highest yoga. And even in texts like the Hatha Pradipika, which are really championing the practice of Haṭhayoga, Haṭhayoga itself is seen as this stairway and as this path that leads to the highest Raja Yoga. Okay, that's our brief sort of survey of the texts. I now want to move on here in the little time that remains, to thinking about this question of yogis with disabilities. And I see Priya Wagner is here. Priya first asked me this question a couple of years ago on behalf of our friends at Accessible Yoga. Is there any evidence of yogis with physical disabilities in the history of yoga? And one of the first stories that came to mind when Priya asked me this question and we talked about is the story of Choranginath. So we'll start with this, and if time, we'll get to one more story at the end. I'm gonna have to kind of rush through this because I see we're really low on time. But this comes from the Telugu Navanatha Charitramu from the 14th century. It's the tale of the 9 nathas, probably the earliest retelling of the story of 9 seminal Nath yogis. And here I'm really drawing on the fantastic dissertation and work of Jamal Jones and his retelling of the story here from the Telugu. So the story begins with the Prince Sarangadhara, and his father is out hunting. His father, the king, is hunting in the forest, and the prince is racing pigeons with his friends. His pigeon flies into the private chambers of his stepmother, Chitrangi, one of the many wives of the king, Raja Mahendra. And Sarangadhara goes to retrieve his bird. His stepmother, Chitrangi, sees him and actually makes sexual advances at the prince. Chorangi, or at this time, the Prince Sarangadhara, politely declines, and she's humiliated and seeks retaliation. And so she actually accuses Sarangadhara of rape when the king returns from his hunting. The king is outraged and orders that the prince be taken to the forest and has his limbs severed. It's a violent, bloody, and unjust scene, and 2 of the ministers proceed to dismember both of his arms and his legs. He's left to die in the forest, where the great Siddha, Matsyendranath, is wandering through the forest, hears the agonizing cries of the prince who's left for dead, and out of compassion, he brings the mutilated prince back to his cave. He nourishes him with milk and healing herbs. And then Matsyendra enters into meditative absorption, into samadhi. He recalls the teachings on Raja Yoga from Shiva, and he instructs the mutilated prince in Raja Yoga. He throws a stone up in the air, and the prince has to concentrate his attention on the rock and hold it in place so that it doesn't drop and crush his head. It's a big stone. And through this act of yogic concentration, this contemplative practice of Raja Yoga, the prince regenerates his limbs, and he obtains what the text calls a siddha deha, a perfected body. The prince is given a new name, Chorangi, which literally means the one with 4 limbs, or 4-limbed. And here's just a few images from the field. These are from Sri Shailam, from the Mallikarjuna Prakata wall. Sri Shailam is a very important place within this history and for the Siddhas, and it's actually where the Navanatha Charitramu was written. You can see in these narrative reliefs where at the top left here, the prince is lying down and he's about to have his limbs chopped off. You can see then in the lower frame, just his hands and feet. And then in the right, he's lying severed in the forest, and Matsyendra, the yogi, is coming and coming to teach. He's in this teaching gesture, and he's also, about to help heal him. But the healing takes place through the means of Raja Yoga. It is interesting to note as well that it's Raja Yoga, not Hatha Yoga, and it's through his internal powers of mental concentration that the regeneration takes place. But we should also keep in mind that the outcome of this and the idealized goal is the Siddha Deha, which is with a regenerated a body that becomes actually immune to any physical decay. Any ailment or disease is virtually indestructible. And then finally, here's one more image of Chorangi from elsewhere, an earlier period from the Mahudi Gate in Gujarat, from the Haṭhayoga project. All right, do we have time for one more story here of Ashtavakra, which is the cover image for the event? I feel like I'd be remiss if we didn't.
Please tell the Ashtavakra story.
Okay, so we'll end with this. And let me also note, this kind of moves us beyond the frames of Hatha and Raja Yoga specifically, this story of Ashtavakra, who you see a modern, rendition of in this beautiful painting here, this occurs in several places, perhaps first in the Mahabharata, and alluded to in the Ramayana, as well as in several Puranas. There's even a Gita, the Ashtavakra Gita, that is at least it's attributed in name, or it's named after this sage, this character. It's sometimes that text is sometimes attributed to Shankara, although it certainly post-dates the 8th or 9th century Advaita philosopher. Nonetheless, the story, as I'm going to retell here in a very abridged form, is from the Mahabharata, where a Brahmin named Kahoda, a disciple of the sage Uddalaka, would study the Vedas and the Shastras every night alongside his pregnant wife, Sujata, who's the daughter of his guru. One evening, while Kahoda was reciting the Vedas, his unborn child within his wife's womb addressed his father from within the womb. He chastised his father for his incorrect reading of the text. Kahoda, the father, was outraged, and he curses his unborn son that he should be crooked in 8 parts of his body. The child was thus born crooked and named Ashtavakra, crooked in 8 ways or 8 places. The child later becomes really a child prodigy of the Vedas, and he defeats King Janaka's court poet, Bandhan, in a contest of Vedic riddles. Bandhan had earlier defeated and ridiculed his father, Kahoda. So when Ashtavakra defeats Bandhan with his sophisticated wisdom, he wins the affection and pride of his father. They return to their hermitage, where his father instructs him to enter into the river. He submerges into the water, and his crooked limbs are made straight. The river is declared and named Samanga, having all limbs, or complete, perfect body. And the river is then said to purify the sins of anyone who bathes in her waters. While this story does not arise out of yoga traditions per se, again, but really the broader Brahminical and Hindu traditions, it nonetheless has surfaced within modern postural yoga traditions in the form of hagiography and even in the naming of a yogasana. And here we'll end with this. B.K.S. Iyengar, in his Light on Yoga, he retells the story of Ashtavakra before describing the technique and even demonstrating it with these black and white plates, the technique for the posture Ashtavakrasana, a posture which, according to Iyengar, strengthens the wrists and arms and also develops the muscles of the abdomen. All right, so I think we'll leave it there for now. Many, many more things to pick up, and I look forward to the conversation on the other side.
Thank you, Seth. That was a fantastic. I'm aware, as you say, that you're not a specialist in disability studies per se, but it's so interesting to get all these kind of fragments of different things and a real sense of the diversity of worldviews and perspectives. Whilst Melanie's just kind of gathering her thoughts, there's just a couple of things I wanted to say whilst I remember. The first is I really love that we finished with Ashtavakrasana because of course, and an image of Iyengar, and I'm interested in how much kind of Iyengar plays in the role of considering yoga and yoga asana and similar and associated practices as a form of therapy, as a form of kind of health, practice for health and well-being. So it's kind of a really neat circle to make that. And I just want to just mention a few names for those of you that don't know in the context and development of yoga, specifically for accessibility and disabilities, as well as Melanie herself. We have to mention Sonia Sumar in Brazil, back in the 80s, really, with Yoga for the Special Child. I think we have to mention in the UK at least Jyoti Jo Manuel at the Special Yoga Centre, who was working from the 90s onwards. You have Matthew Sanford, of course, in the US from 2002, and Jivana Heyman, who I know really wanted to be here tonight and is a friend of many of us, from Accessible Yoga. So I just want to kind of make sure those names get mentioned in case we forget them, as being part of that a really complex conversation about making yoga accessible. And hopefully that's given Melanie enough time to kind of formulate some thoughts and responses.
Thanks for having me, Theo, Vicky, and the entire team. It's been such a pleasure to be here. This was sort of a spontaneous thing, actually, and I didn't quite know what to expect, and I've been so pleased and engaged by everything that Seth presented. I had the good fortune about 20 years ago of attending several lectures of David White over at UC Santa Barbara, which was a really wonderful sort of supplement to my own academic background. And so just kind of, loved getting immersed in that today, and just reminded me, to be quite honest, of, how sociology is such a great partner to actually, if we're looking at religious studies, if we're looking at disability studies, if we're taking, a look at, history of political science. And so similar to Seth, I really appreciated the disclaimers that you presented, and kind of in that vein, I want to just offer a very sort of brief perspective on how I'm entering this conversation and sort of what I see my role here. First and foremost, it's, just going to spend about 10 minutes bringing in some sociological terms and principles that I think will help to kind of illuminate the things that Seth has already talked about, but giving some language and some new ways, I would say, to analyze where we're currently at. And Seth, as you had mentioned, looking at the past without any, judgment, but really starting to understand it within the context in which those traditions and those ideologies and practices existed. So I'm coming in as a sociologist. I've been a professor for 18 years, studying sociology and social justice since about 1994, which kind of blows my mind now that it's been that long. And also coming in, honestly, as a practitioner who started my yoga practice and meditation practice in 1996, and found that that was the perfect partner to my emerging, sociological education, my feminist studies at the time, my media literacy education. And those things were all sort of emerging right there in the mid-90s together. And I found them to be such wonderful partners in kind of understanding my own place as a woman in the broader society, making sense of my experiences, and being able to kind of reimagine and recreate as an active, engaged member of the culture, as opposed to seeing culture as something static, as something that is pre-existing that I had no control over. And so when I, was going through my graduate studies, was very interested in understanding yoga culture and practice in the United States through the lenses of, let's say, Karl Marx, Horkheimer, Durkheim, to really begin to understand the changes that were very, very apparent right around 2000 as we were moving into the new millennium. I started seeing a lot of different trends. So, writing about the cult of celebrity. I did an academic paper at the time in about 2005 on really, I called it Mick Yoga, right? A lot of work by George Ritzer, the sociologist that talked about the sort of automation of various practices. And so I felt really, honestly, compelled to begin to merge these areas to offer a greater critical consciousness for those who were in yoga and wellness communities in North America, the United States, and Europe, but also to bring some of these really helpful principles and practices into social justice, into sociology and feminism. I felt that they could very much benefit from one another. So today I'm coming in from that particular background with that particular lens. And, I'm looking at all of the attendees today, and I'm so impressed. I know many of you from the accessible yoga community, the Yoga and Body Image Coalition, and I see quite a few contributors to several of the books that I published over the years. And so with that, I think I want to start by just talking about how sociology is such a great partner to what Seth has already presented to us in such great detail, which is it's really starting to understand the relationship between society and the individual, right? And sociology in many ways takes elements from a lot of the other social sciences and humanities and combines them in this perspective, which is we want to understand individuals and groups within the time and place in which they exist. And I heard you reference that a couple of times, Seth, which I really appreciated, because of course, when we look back, even if I'm looking at the women's movement globally, or if I'm, looking at other social movements, we can so quickly go to the place where we judge or use our current lens to make sense of what occurred in a different time and place. So I think that when we use the sociological imagination to begin to understand that we as individuals and groups, we have agency and we have power in constructing the culture, the symbols, the systems of meaning, right? We call it the social construction of reality. So when Seth was talking about, these hierarchies that existed with practitioners and types of yoga, right? We have to understand that the hierarchies themselves, the ideologies created, the texts created, the interpretations, right, are all subject to the time and place in which we exist, and were created by people, and yet those people were also influenced by the systems and structures that existed. So that's been what's so fascinating to me, especially in taking a look at the emerging yoga industrial complex, separating the business of yoga, the culture of yoga from the practice of yoga, is reminding ourselves that when we're looking at symbols and systems of meaning, they reflect those systems that are in place, which, if we're looking currently, are racist, are sexist, are ableist, are homophobic, are classist, are sizist, and we could go on. And so we want to really not only critically take a look, right, through that lens at the past, but also employ some cultural relativism, which is really trying to understand, what were the systems, the practices that were in place at the time? What were the codes of conduct? How were these symbols and systems of meaning created? Who were they meant to serve? What was their intention, right? And how can we then effectively engage in sort of reimagining that while being sensitive to power structures that exist? Because while we want to employ cultural relativism and we want to make sure that we're checking our own ethnocentrism at the door, we also have to simultaneously keep in mind that cultures are a very dynamic emerging system. We as humans, right, are creating them. That society and those systems are impacting our own perspective. And as we move through time and as social events occur, they're inevitably going to look different. And so when we consider that, we can, first of all, take a look at how the culture, the practice, and the business of yoga exist in North America and Europe is very different than, from its origins and from the past. And as Marx would say, every single thing passes through the lens of the culture. Nothing is immune, which is why I use George Ritzer's work in talking about make yoga, right? It makes sense that as we began to see, we of course saw yoga, right, in the 1920s here in North America, especially in places like Encinitas, et cetera, right here in Santa Monica in the Pacific Palisades where I live. But we also saw a huge emergence in the 1960s and early 1970s. Nonetheless, the big yoga bubble, if you want to call it that, right, really began to take off in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it underwent some really drastic changes, which included commercialization, objectification, right? It included sexualization, and all of these sort of values, or what we as a culture aspire to be or believe is important. We projected that onto the practice and we created something entirely new. And on one hand, right, that's not surprising to me as a sociologist, yet at the same time, we have to be mindful of power structures and take into account cultural appropriation. So there are all of these pieces to the puzzle. And I'll be honest, what really drove me in about 2010 to start to bring some of these ideas into the yoga spaces was that I found there was so much sort of spiritual bypassing and such a resistance to begin to think critically and to think intellectually about these practices and the sort of constant evolution of these ideologies and practices and the ways that we look at them. And I wanted to really begin to challenge people to practice mindfully, right? As they sort of would state that your yoga was giving them, but truly to apply it to their own interaction with the practice and practitioners and the ways in which studios and yoga culture and yoga publications were representing specifically the yoga body, right? Which in the work over the last 11 years, both by Diane Bondi, Dr. Chelsea Jackson, Dr. Beth Barilla, obviously Matt Remsky, et cetera, talking about the fact that they essentially were mimicking those fitness and fashion magazines and that entire culture that existed here, which is different than what Seth was describing. But at the same time, right, Seth, you were talking about accessibility, who had access to the practices, who was represented in the practices, which reflected its own systems and structures of that particular time. No different here. And I wanted people to think consciously about that, because what I found in yoga practice, which I'm sure everyone can attest to here, is that in some way we feel called to continue to practice because it has made our lives better, richer, right? Maybe more bearable, more comfortable. Maybe we've connected to the essence of ourselves. Maybe it's allowed us to connect to community. And I felt that that should be something that everyone should have access to. So taking that into account as well, my mission really was, I fiercely love my practice, and I want to make sure that as many people have access and are not barred because of a lack of diversity, a lack of representation and accessibility, whether it's financial, whether it's about accommodations, whatever it may be. And so in listening to all of this, I feel that if we can continue to ask critical questions, begin to engage critically, and at the same time that we're holding power structures accountable and we're challenging them, we also want to take a very sort of, objective or value neutral analysis of how we've gotten to this particular point, and really begin to ask those questions about, who's in power, who's benefiting, who is creating this particular system of meaning, and how can we honor those traditions, but at the same time, really make sure that it reflects, right, our current re-emerging value system. Because we're in a process of really re-socialization within yoga culture in North America, Europe, and I would even say Australia and New Zealand, right? That there's been a socialization process in terms of how we see things and what we expect and how we see our place within it. And I would say for the last 10 years, we've really been re-evaluating that history. We've been re-evaluating how we've come to this point and what we can do to expand this. This conversation includes, if we're talking about the social construction of reality, Seth, you had mentioned this a little bit too, how do we view the body, right? How do we view the body within the context of the practice? How do we define health? How do we define wellness? And oftentimes what we find is that concepts of health and wellness are primarily influenced by concepts of fitness and beauty that we have in the culture. And so there's just a real effort on my part in the work of the coalition and the books that I put together to really sort of deconstruct these aspects and begin to, check between, again, cultural relativism, staying objective, value neutral, with ethnocentrism, keeping in mind that cultural appropriation, beginning to really ask questions about social hierarchies, while simultaneously knowing that just because we may share, right, a gender identity, a sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, etc., we also have an intersectional framework that we need to consider. So a large part of this work has also been bringing in intersectional feminism so that we're not thinking within these very one-dimensional axes of analysis, that we're actually bringing them together to have a much more holistic framework of understanding. And so really at the crux of it is, taking a look at those power structures, how they're created, how they're maintained, and how we can actively, right, recreate them, understanding that culture is absolutely fluid. There's nothing set about it. I could go on. There's so many more things. And Theo, if you want to reflect on our conversation on Monday, I literally have notes all over the place from when Seth was speaking. If there's anything that, you know, you can recall from our conversation that you want me to touch on, my main intention here was just to bring some of these concepts and terms to the forefront in terms of how people who maybe don't have anywhere near the kind of richness of understanding that Seth does of these, you know, of the history of this, some of the things that are important for modern practitioners to consider as they're kind of, I think, making sense of the world that we're currently living in within the yoga community.
Thank you. That is, I think we've touched on a lot. To be fair, we've packed a lot in already. I'm so struck how these very different disciplines of sociology and of, you know, and of history have this common idea, which is to reflect on differences in time, differences in space, and how that allows us to reflect on the kind of the structures and biases and processes present in our own spaces. I'm also struck by the really beautiful commonalities. You know, when Seth mentioned that there's that quote about success happens for he who practices. I think that's something that most practitioners and teachers would repeat today. You know, that's the point. You have to do the practice, and if you have to do the practice, whatever it is, whatever that practice is, then how do we then make that practice available to as many people as possible? Does every form of yoga have to be accessible to everyone? You know, or is it possible to get different, you know, different benefits for different people from different kinds of practice? You know, does it all have to be asana based? Can it be, you know, in terms of Bhakti yoga or seva, or, you know, all the other things that we can consider? And, you know, one of the things that I like to throw in from disability studies, which is something I've done a tiny bit of work into, is that I don't think modern practitioners are necessarily aware of how recent and specific the very development of the idea of disability and difference is. The very word normal, as it is applied to human beings, is a very recent invention. We would not have considered people as being normal or abnormal or disabled or different. We would only have considered ideal human beings and the rest of us ordinary human beings up until a very recent kind of period of time. And I don't think people know about the links between the development of that idea of normal and the eugenics movement and colonialism and industrialization. So, you know, all of our ideas over what is it that we're trying to get in terms of if we're trying to get practitioners to a point, to an aim, what is that aim? Is it a form of normality? Is it a form of well-being? How are we defining that well-being? And these are the debates I think that we're still having in many different contexts today. And of course, I think we finally have to say that in all of that, then we have to ask ourselves who gets to take part in the conversation, which is part of the job, I think, in many ways we're all involved in, is trying to open up the thing, access to research, trying to open up access to ideas as widely as possible, because otherwise, you know, it's the people with the power who continue to get to tell the stories, right? So on that basis, if we're happy, unless Seth, you have anything you want to come back on, and like get your questions in the Slido whilst we're doing that. Seth.
Yeah, I'll just add a very, very brief remark, and then let's leave as much time to questions. But just in listening to Melanie, what I was reminded of, and what I didn't have time to talk about, you know, here in this limited space, but in thinking about the social construction of realities and the very ideologies and practices that we're seeing documented in the texts, you know, first of all, we're really limited in terms of the sources that we have to construct a social history of yoga, right? We have texts, we have inscriptions, which tell us very little, sometimes the names of a yogi. We have, some architecture in the form of temples or mattas, some institutions that maybe remain. We have images and sculptures, but overall, really quite little, and we're having to make a lot of leaps and speculations. So that's really important to acknowledge. We're also in a process of learning and relearning so much about this history that we should have some humility in offering any kind of authoritative or history or final word on any of these topics, as far as I'm concerned. But I wanted to say something about, if we're thinking about the institutional, social, and even political landscapes surrounding the composition of these texts. One thing that Jim Mallinson has recently been theorizing, drawing on the work of Manu Devadevan and his work on the construction of religious identity and even Hinduism in the Deccan in South India in the medieval period, is that there was the rise of these mattas, these monastic institutions from around the 12th and 13th century and onwards, and that there's a very likely possibility, as we see with a text like the Navanatha Charitramu, that these texts were written from within these monastic institutional sites. And so that's very interesting and helpful for thinking about locating the authors and the ideas, and then we can think wider about what then the concerns were of those authors and what was going on in the social realities behind those texts during that time. But the other really big component here, and kind of the elephant in the room for thinking about yoga and accessibility in pre-modern India and even contemporary India, is caste. Right? And we really didn't talk about that much, and it's really a whole other and very complex and multifaceted conversation. I don't think enough work has really been done on this in thinking about caste and yoga historically. I think we kind of take for granted that most of the authors of the Sanskrit text were likely Brahmins if they were educated in Sanskrit and writing these texts in Sanskrit. But we also have vernacular texts to appeal to, although I think many of them are drawing on the Sanskrit sources. They're highly learned, writers in Telugu or Kannada and so forth. But we know that a lot of the yogis that are being documented, like in the Navanatha Charitramu, are coming from kshatriya, princely or kingly, kind of warrior and royal backgrounds. There's a long history of kshatriya engagement with yoga. Think about the Mahabharata and Arjuna and all of that, or the Buddha or Mahavira. So caste, just to put that there, and thinking about who is able to access a guru and initiation and so forth. But then also a whole other topic for discussion in thinking about this is Bhakti and Tantra, which in very different ways are responding to the normative institutionalized values of the Brahminical kind of orthodox, quote unquote Hindu tradition. Both Bhakti and Tantra are responding in various ways to things like caste, gender, certain ideological value systems of purity and impurity and so forth. And so thinking about how yoga fits into those is very multifaceted and complex. But so just to put that out there, and then we can touch on maybe some of that more if there's specific questions, but just wanted to add that.
Thank you. I think there's a really important point. I'm just going to say I'm slightly aware of time. We are usually quite happy to run over by a few minutes, but I just want to point out that I know Melanie does have to go bang on 15:15. So we'll I'll filter questions accordingly, and they're coming in on the Slido, which is great. So I'm gonna bring up Harriet. Is Harriet available? I know Harriet. She's a good friend. I'm hoping that someone can find her to unmute her.
Yeah. Hello.
Hey, Harriet.
In the dark.
So you've got a couple of questions. Do you want to ask, like maybe ask both of them, and then they've got time to think about their responses?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think in part, Seth, you've already started answering my question, which was, you know, how does caste come into it? So I would love to hear more about that, because I think primarily for me, and it's how I see it come through into sort of contemporary practice, it's this idea that before we even get to the I don't know, the physical accessibility of the practice, it's that yoga is for people, like of certain groups and classes, and particularly, I mean, I'm very much informed by the UK context, but particularly in the UK, there is people that yoga is for, and then people who yoga is not for. So so that was sort of my question, and also like what Melanie's thoughts on that would be. If that, yeah, that's me.
I can add a little bit more to what I was already saying. I mean, first thinking about, if we think of caste as a really specific ideology and social structure that's unique to the Indian subcontinent and civilizations, it's going to have very specific nuances and histories. And there is a voluminous body of literature analyzing, contesting, and exploring and challenging all of the nuances of caste. And it really is a topic that deserves its own space and discussion. This is not to bypass it. I want to acknowledge it. As it pertains to yoga, it's complex, because I think we have evidence that, you know, there were Brahmins doing yoga, and we have yoga practices described in the kind of quote unquote Brahminical literature. I would say the Yoga Sutra is a good evidence of that. You see in the Dharma Shastras, prescriptions like doing pranayama for Brahmins. If they transgress their purity norms, if they come into contact with someone who's low caste, it says, do a couple rounds of pranayama and you can purify. This sort of thing. So that runs through, but again, I pointed to the kind of really important engagements with yoga and the Kshatriya Varna, or the warrior caste, that really run all throughout yoga's history, from, you know, Gautama Buddha and Mahavira to, you know, Arjuna, to all the way to the Natha yogis in kind of the medieval India, and then all the way through to contemporary India. If you look at the political landscape of India today, and the engagement of royalty, politicians, and yogis. But then you can think about caste today, contemporary, more loosely defined, and we certainly can see forms of a caste system in other societies, right? And you were mentioning in the UK and certainly in North America, and thinking about what groups are being privileged and having access to yoga, who are being discriminated against. Melanie, you know, you brought up all of the lists of reasons why someone might not have access to. I think you can think of those as caste systems more loosely based, but also understanding that what we call the caste system is something very specific and unique to the Indian civilization. I don't know, Melanie, if you want to add anything to it, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit. You know, as you were asking that question, Harriet, I was thinking back to some of the things that Seth had already presented, and I had mentioned earlier stratification. So stratification is really, it's a layering process, which I'm sure many of you already know. It's a ranking system. It's a way of looking at how we have, you know, structured inequality essentially embedded into our society. And if we look at stratification systems historically and globally, obviously the caste system is a form of stratification. That's a closed system of stratification. If we look at systems of slavery, specifically chattel slavery worldwide, that's another system of stratification that's closed. The estate system in the UK, right, would be a stratification system. And what we have in the United States and many parts of the world now is an open system of stratification, where we do have movement, yet nonetheless we're each born into you know, these different layers, and it's not just based on our socioeconomic status, but as I'd mentioned earlier, right, we have a whole aggregate of social locations that come together that place us, you know, in a relationship to what we would have at the top, the rewards and resources of society in the form of power, privilege, and prestige. And as Seth had mentioned, right, those who are higher up obviously we have greater access, or they have greater access. There is greater privilege, fewer obstacles, and obviously depending on what your unique aggregate of social locations is, if you're further down, you're going to have a harder time. And so if we look at yoga and yoga practices, we can see that obviously as a resource. And those who are higher up in the stratification system, even though movement is possible, are going to have greater access, either because of their, you know, abilities, their ability to, you know, live in communities and spaces where they have access to knowledge, or to studios, or to teachers, etc., the ability to pay. So really what we see now is just a variation of what existed, you know, historically, that Seth had described earlier. So that stratification system, i.e. a different form of caste system, is very much at work, and is part of what has inspired both my work, the work of Jivana Heyman, etc., is to make sure that we're creating that accessibility and not allowing that ranking system to bar people from having access to practices that are really liberatory on many levels, right?
Thank you. And it's yeah, these are all really important points. I'm going to actually pull up a question that's slightly lower down, Melanie, to make, because I know you're going to want to answer this one, I think. Is Emanuela Mangiarotti unmutable? Sorry, folks, I'm making the team scramble to find people. And if not, I'm happy to read it. Hey, Emanuela, could you ask your question? I think you mostly, I think this is one for Melanie.
Yeah, I think it's a general question for this meeting, actually. No, yeah, I was just because I have been doing some research on you know, this idea of yoga for all, and yoga having to be accessible to all. And so I was, yeah, my question is mostly how much this whole discourse about accessibility comes from positions of privilege and is framed in terms of making yoga our yoga accessible to others. And so how much are we ready to let go of how we imagine yoga should be? Because, you know, it's just like cultural repertoires that keep reproducing themselves. And so, yeah, that's.
Thank you. I think that's a great question, and yeah, I'd love to hear Melanie's thoughts on it. And I'm just going to throw in a phrase that comes from disability activism and disability studies, which is nothing about us without us. And I'm aware that, to my knowledge, we don't necessarily have that many disabled people teaching yoga in many ways. Melanie, if you do have anything to kind of contribute to that.
Yeah, and actually, you know, knowing that I have to make my son lunch soon. It is 12:15 in Southern California, and I've got a middle schooler upstairs. But one of the things that I had just organically wanted to share, very much helps to answer your question, Emanuela, is, I mean, that's part of what's so important about really creating this critical consciousness and bringing it into the yoga and wellness spaces, which again, definitely 10 years ago, and in many places now, are very resistant and adverse to critical consciousness. There's been a big pushback. There was a huge backlash definitely 10 years ago. And to a certain degree, there still is, even as much as these conversations have grown, and they've grown exponentially since 2010, exponentially. But there are still a lot of people who don't want to be burdened or have these inconvenient truths and questions coming into their practices, which speaks to their privilege right there, right? And yet we are having these conversations, and part of having these conversations is beginning to deconstruct who's really at the forefront of these conversations, which is why I shared this a bit with Theo, is, you know, in many ways, I feel my contributions are complete. I continue to, you know, do things like this and write, but for me, it's primarily creating platforms for other people to take up space, right? There is a very specific reason why the 4 books that I've published over the last 11 years are all intersectional anthologies. For me, I never wanted to be the person taking my academic background or personal experience and centering it or putting it at the forefront, knowing that I do have privilege. I am able-bodied. I am a white woman. I am cisgender, you know, heterosexual. And yet at the same time, you know, I have a very deep experience with social justice work. I have my own experiences as a woman within patriarchy that have compelled me, but because of my intersectional feminist teaching so early on, I understood that I couldn't speak for that many people. And I wanted to create platforms and opportunities for others to have that opportunity. And I think that's what we're doing in these accessible yoga spaces, is making sure that we are creating very diverse platforms where we're not speaking for others, but that we're actually truly empowering others to redefine this whole thing. And we're in the process of still redefining it. There are so many questions about, you know, what is this going to look like? And what is this image that we are trying to make accessible? And what's exciting about that is, you know, in my reflections is, again, we've come so far in the last 11 years. It's profound and mind-blowing to me, right? And we're still in the process of truly recreating. I think it was in Yoga and Body Image, right? There is an essay talking about exactly that process, is that we are really kind of the architects of the kind of culture that we want to create. We get to reimagine these things and what does it look like? And I think that we're still kind of forming that as a community, growing as a community, while still, right, beginning to push back and really kind of call up and out this other vein of yoga culture that exists, right? Because I think for a lot of people here, we recognize that this is truly one of the most engaging conversations and themes in yoga and wellness. But if you go look at other platforms, the same sort of hypermobile, right, ageist, sexist, ableist yoga still exists, and it's still being mass produced. So there are these two kind of continuing threads going on. And so we have to work in a way in which we're constantly checking ourselves and checking our own privilege, which is why, you know, we have to have conversations about what that is and what that means, and be very honest with ourselves about how does our privilege get recreated? How do I continue to carry that through and not use it in service? And looking to our left, right, and continuing to call out and call up these yoga publications and these large companies who, while teachers have been decimated by the pandemic, they have been reaping huge profits. Right? So there's a lot of different things to happen simultaneously. And I truly believe that if we are using our practice in the way that we oftentimes say, that we continue to elevate our consciousness, I'm in full faith that we're going to continue to unravel this kind of mystery in this conversation and come out the other side with something that is incredibly beautiful, truly accessible, where we're not inviting people into, quote, the norm, right, that's been created by the dominant structures, but actually something that truly reflects the diversity across the spectrum. So that's my hope and my wish, and definitely what I've seen over the last 11 years.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm really aware, in order to make this event accessible to you, you really need to get off and do family things. The call of the household is ever there, right? Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon on something, I hope. Seth, are you okay to keep going for another kind of 10 minutes or so? Is that okay for you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome, thank you. Because
let's keep it rolling.
Brilliant, because we've got the geeky questions are coming in. So I'm gonna start with a big one, and you can, you know, it's up to you how far you think you can answer this question, but it's been highly upvoted on the Slido, which is, could you respond to the concept of the perfect body in the yogic treatise of the past and historic context as opposed to contemporary yogic culture? What does that perfect body kind of look like, and how has it evolved? It's a bit of a starter for 10. Can you do that in 2 minutes? No pressure.
I'm tempted to just tell everybody, go read this great article by Lubomir Ondraka, who I think might be here. I thought I saw his name earlier, and who was a guest speaker recently. He's got a great article. Honestly, please go read it. Perfected Bodies, Divine Bodies. Hopefully I'm getting the title correctly, where he does a survey of really the Sanskrit literature on not yogis and what we can and cannot say about their vision of this idea of a perfected body. And it's messy, it's complex. There's different things that are said by scholars. There's different things that are represented actually in the texts. You probably get different views if you actually just asked, you know, not yogis in India today. What I will say that from my perspective in reading this literature, there's a variety of views, what I would say ontologies of the body that are sort of simultaneously present and that can be detected across the text. On the one hand, the body is a big pile of blood and pus and mucus and liable to be filled with disease and pain, and is something that needs to be healed. That's something that can be transformed, transmuted. And Hatha Yoga practice, I mean, one of the primary aims, honestly, that we see throughout the texts is to purify the body, to get rid of these mental and physical toxins within the body. Particular asanas that are aimed at eradicating diseases within the body. So they're really, if we're thinking about physical health and mental health and wellness, the medieval Sanskrit literature does anticipate some of those modern ideas of quote unquote yoga therapy, but I'm always very hesitant to use that language because of course what we mean by yoga therapy or therapeutics or wellness today, has very different valences and contexts. But there is something like that going on, and the body is being healed, if you will. It is being transmuted through these practices. So there's that kind of gross and physical level of the body that is being perfected, if you will, through Hatha Yoga. But ultimately, I mean, the Mahasiddhas, the great adepts, those who have the siddhis, the powers from yoga, they are said to have attained what is sometimes called a siddha deha. Now, if Lubomir is here, he's probably shaking his head because as he's pointed out, we don't really find this term in the Sanskrit literature. But Lubomir, it is in the Navanatha Charitramu, right? So maybe in the vernacular literature, maybe, and we'll have to talk about this later, but maybe it comes up more from the vernacular, the siddha deha, the perfected body. Nonetheless, whatever the term for it is called, the descriptions are pretty clear through the text that the yogi develops this body that is immutable, that can no longer succumb to disease, to this kind of gross and physical ailment, and doesn't die, conquers death. Kalavanchana is the cheater of death and time. So there is this goal of the attainment of immortality, of actually transcending time and death. And eliminating any physical or mental suffering that accompanies it. These yogis are then said to be able to take on other forms, other bodily forms, to even inhabit other bodies. There's then another layer, certain texts like the Yoga Bija, and then when we look at some of the hagiographical literature, and actually here's where kind of some of the Bhakti and yoga stuff converge, things that I'm looking at, you do see a critique of this kind of hardened adamantine physical body and this idealization of another type of body that's beyond form, that's a more ethereal, akasha-like body, that where all of prakriti and the gunas and all of the physical constituents have actually dissolved through the fire of one's yoga, and one achieves something that's more like an ethereal body, one in which when a sword tries to attack it, it actually penetrates and moves through the body. So as you can see, there's a complexity here, and there's a very sophisticated and there's really subtle dimensions and discussions and even disagreement within yoga traditions about what this idealized body is that is perfected through yoga practice, what it means to attain a state of liberation in this very body, which is often a goal of medieval Hatha Yoga, this idea of Jivan Mukti, of attaining a kind of liberation while embodied, and what that body then looks like, what one is able to do with such a body. Now then, part of your question was contrasting that with contemporary goals and ideas of the body. And I'm not going to enter into that. There's a lot of directions one could go with that. I think it's also messy. I think there's just also many different philosophies and ideologies that are shaping the goals of a modern yoga practice. But by and large, I would venture to guess, I don't want to assume for all practitioners across transnational yoga time and space, most people are probably not trying to attain immortality or a body that cannot be pierced by a sword, but that have other, perhaps even more practical goals of what they want their yoga practice to do to their body. So I'll leave it there for now. So hopefully
well done.
To some degree.
Well done. If he's up for it, Lubomir is here actually, and I know he's got a point, not exactly a question, but a kind of useful point to bring up. And if he's up for it, Lubomir,
yes,
do you want to make
yes,
that? Yes,
I'm here. Yeah, hi.
Hey, Lubomir.
Yeah.
Hi, Lubomir.
Hi, Seth.
What do you think about Siddha Deha in the Navanatha Charitra?
Yes, the idea that finally the yogis are striving for a perfected body, the immune, etc. Exactly what you said. That's no doubt. Yeah, my research was on more on the term and on the concept of transformation of the material body into some kind of a spiritual immaterial body, and that's what I disagree with. I don't think that it's easy to find these concepts of transformation, but that the final goal is a physical immortality in the physical material body. That's the point, I think. Yeah. So you were absolutely right. Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah. So thanks for mentioning this.
And in your comment on slide A, you talked about you wanted to remind us of the fact that there are different yoga practices for different social groups.
Yes. There are some texts. One is quite important, I think, and well known. Is the Yoga Yajnavalkya, and this text prescribes different practices for different, not exactly castes, but varnas, social groups in ancient India. That's quite normal in Sanskrit literature, not in normative Sanskrit literature, not to talk about castes, jatis, but about varnas. So that's quite correct. And it's interesting that it prescribes various practice for different types, for different varnas. So Brahmins will do this, Kshatriyas will do this, Shudras this. So, and that's quite exceptional, I think. Something is understandable. For example, in the section on mantra, it's clear that Shudras are not allowed to pronounce the highest, the pranava, Om. So it's different practice for them. But also in some other sections, if I remember correctly, it's on Brahmacharya, that because this text is definitely for householders, so the text had to redefine what's Brahmacharya, and it says that Brahmacharya in fact is sexual enjoyment with wife in a proper time. I mean, proper time from a dharmic point of view, it means after menstruation, etc., etc. And but Shudra cannot do this. You know, that's just for the for the Vijjas, and several other interesting things. So at least this important text touched this problem that there is various practice for different classes. So I think that's quite interesting.
Thank you, Lubomir. That's I think that's all really important points, and it's nice to have you back. I guess there's a link for me, just to kind of slightly round this up, on whether I think sometimes that what we have in commercial transnational yoga can be such a narrow form of practice that then all of the focus becomes on making that narrow form of practice as accessible to as wide a range of people, rather than necessarily drawing on other aspects within kind of yogic traditions, which may be more easy, more inherently accessible, such as, Bhakti yoga, for example, and, the other things that we don't have as much time to go into. Seth, I know you mentioned Tantra as well, in that context. We have one last tiny question, if it's all right, Seth, which is, how many texts other than the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, there's my inability to pronounce Sanskrit, how many other texts promote universalism, if there are any, basically?
Well, first of all, I should put universalism in sort of scare quotes there, because it's a certain type of, I guess, kind of more trans-sectarianism, I think, that it seems like the author is concerned with in that text. You see variations of that across other texts. I mean, most poignantly in the Hatha Pradipika of Svatmarama, where those verses from the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra are actually recycled, because Svatmarama was kind of doing a cut and paste job, and he's borrowing from a lot of the earlier texts in his compilation. But it is interesting, he drops out the line about Brahmanas, Shramanas, Jainas, Kapalikas. He actually takes that line out and just puts the practice, or the line about anybody who's young, old, weak, or or diseased can attain success as long as they do the practice. So there's across a lot of the literature, there is this theme again of the emphasis on practice, doing it if you want to attain success. Just do it, as it were. But the type of universalism that the Dattatreya, let's say, is espousing, I'd say that's slightly unique, where it's really going that far and is mentioning all of these different categories of practitioners or religious identities. I think that's a little bit more unique. And also in other texts, like the text I'm working on, the Shiva Yoga Pradipika, just as a counterexample, it's not really espousing that kind of universalism. Like, it's a text on Shiva Yoga for Shaivas. It's not saying it doesn't matter if you worship Shiva or Vishnu or Ganesha or whomever is your Ishtadeva. No, it's not saying that. It's a text very much and exclusively for a Shaiva community and audience. So there's kind of both and going on, and it really depends on the text and the author and maybe the concerns and intentionality behind the composition of a text. But then even within that Shiva yoga context, there's kind of moments where it is saying, well, here's yoga or an asana for a householder, here's an asana for an ascetic. So within a broader Shaiva tent, there's then kind of room for levels of accessibility, if you will. So we have to tread carefully and lightly with the sources. I've made a lot of generalizations in trying to do a brief survey in a short period of time, but in general, we should be really skeptical of those types of generalizations, and we should really try to understand these texts and authors and communities, within their own context. But of course, these texts are very much related and in conversation. Again, I mentioned the Hatha Pradipika that's borrowing from the Dattatreya and so on. So it is a conversation, perhaps not unlike the one that we're having today, as these ideas live on, right?
Exactly.
But if I could just end with one thought, is that, when looking at the historical past for yoga, I think we should be careful not to just cherry pick the evidence, which I might have even been victim of doing today. We really should try to understand it in its fullest context. And if we want to understand what yoga was on its own terms, we should try to allow those materials and texts and authors to sort of speak for themselves and try to get out of the way. But if we want to just extract things from the past and use them to support our practice or intentions in the present, that's fine. But I think we can be honest about how we're doing that and the ways in which we're using the past to construct the present and future.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point to kind of close on. I'm aware as well as ever as how much work there is to be done. I think sometimes people aren't aware of quite how few people are involved in yogic studies as a discipline, and how much research we'd love to do if we had the time and the resource to do it. There's definitely a huge piece of work, even just looking at the development of kind of, you know, concerns around disability and accessibility in modern, and even in the modern history of yoga. I'm fascinated about how many people that I mentioned in that list of people that have been involved in the development of you know, yoga for accessibility, how many of them are connected to the integral yoga tradition, and why that might be. For example, there's all sorts of hidden histories there. I'm also aware we're well over time, which makes this really, for me, truly reflective of a good scholarly conversation, because this is all of those conferences when it's, you know, it's midnight and you haven't got to bed because you're in the bar still geeking out about this, that and the other. This is exactly what it's like at conferences, except for 3 or 4 days at a time.